Hey Crosskart fans, today we're putting a reverse gearbox on the budget cart, the Harbor Freight Predator 459 engine. I've got a 40 series torque converter on there, and this is the only gearbox rated for higher horsepower engines than the standard 212s that you can find out there. Now this was a $300 option, but $300 for reverse I don't think is a terrible deal. Considering it's the only way to get reverse. So unless you're gonna pay $3 grand for some fancy box, we're gonna try our best to make this work. Now, the standard output of a 40 series torque converter with a keyed axle is a 420 chain. So I've got a 420 setup. The output of this is a 520 chain. It's like a 1-inch 6-spline axle. It's kind of weird. I could not find alternate sprockets for this. I was trying to find a 420 sprocket to fit the 1-inch 6-spline shaft, and I can't find any. It's not the standard go-kart 6-spline shafts that some of them have. It's bigger, it's something different, and I can't track it down. But the budget cart has a KJ Racing center spool on it. So that's an easy swap out for us. It's just a new end plate, and boom, we've got a 520 or 530 sprocket that we can just bolt right in. So that swap will be easy. Fitting up this, it's probably gonna be hard, but let's just get started on it. Let's tackle this thing. We can do it. All right, so first things first is gonna be engine removal. I gotta see how that box works into this, and I'm going to have to cut this motor mount plate off and shift it over. But that's the beauty of these generator engines, is that they're super easy to work with. I don't have coolant. I don't even have to drain the oil. I just unbolt 4 bolts, pop the chain loose, take it out. It's so awesome. All right, so before I actually pull the motor, I've got all the bolts out, it's loose in here. I did a little bit of test fitting just to check some clearances, which I already knew about, but I was just trying to confirm it. I'm gonna have to relocate the gas tank, which is no big deal at all, but look how compact this is. It fits in just behind this 459. Oh, it's actually really, really nice. It adds maybe 3 inches to the back of it, but the chain output is also going to change. So those are the considerations we have to take into account when we pull this motor and start fitting this gearbox on. All right, so the motor's out. I've pulled the bearings out of my 40 series torque converter plate, and I am doing a quick test fit. Now you can see this goes in here pretty nicely. Looks like we're going to get some interference from the housing just a little bit as far as putting it on. I don't know if it'll slide past it with those bearings in. Another thing is the shifter. We need clearance for that so that we can switch between forward, neutral, and reverse. Obviously the 40 series can be clocked a little bit, but the biggest thing is that this is going to require some clearancing. Now we've got our secondary, and you can see this shaft is not super long coming off of this. So to try to fit this on the end after this is in place, there's just not enough. So I have marked my plate where it needs cut. How I figure it is I need this tube to be 1.5 inches long so that the nut will go on the end, the secondary will fit, and the bearings will press back into this tube. Now that's a pretty aggressive cut, and it's going to destabilize this whole shaft, but this shaft is already stabilized by gears internally. So it already has basically an end plate. It's going to be held on either side. So I'm not worried about this tube. This may have been designed to be just completely displaced, but that's not how I'm going to do it. I want it nice and tidy right in there. So this setup would have worked out really, really well. You can see I've got enough threads on the nut here. Tighten that down. This fits under here. The trimming we took off, this spins freely, but if you haven't seen it yet, I didn't account for something. Did not account for that flange coming off the motor, which gaps the primary about a ½ inch off. So if we move this out to align the secondary correctly, we have 0 threads left on here. So I got to take all this apart, cut more off of here. But like I said, this is going to be supported, so the shaft is supported. So we need minimal bearings as just a pass through for here, just something to hold it in place. We don't need 2 of them because that's not the only thing holding the shaft. All right, so what I'm going for here is a uniform 3/4 of an inch gap. I cut this off as much as it would go, and then I'm just using my flapper wheel to get the last 1/16 or so off and to make sure it's uniform all the way around. That's the measurement I came up for the clearance I need. Yours may be different, so don't, unless you're using the same exact stuff I have. That'll allow us to put in the bearing. The gearbox will fit here, and we'll have another ½ inch to, I don't know, 5/8 inches of thread, and also offset for our secondary. All right, so final test fit before I press in the bearing. There's not room for both bearings anymore, so I'm going to press the inside one. Then I'll run the shaft through, and my spacing is going to be, I don't know, about right there or so. And we ran into a little bit of luck. So since we're not running the outside, since we're not pressing in the outside bearing, we don't have the bearing for the secondary to ride on. But here's the lucky part. Our retaining collars used for spacing for the belt slide inside this housing. So we can use those collars to help offset the secondary. Line up our belt, everything will be solid and secure, and I'll just tighten those collars and tap them in, and hopefully that spacing's right. And there's also washers and all this normal stuff we can use as well. Yeah, these kits come with all kinds of stuff. We've got a bushing, we've got washers, so we can absolutely line everything up to get our belt running perfectly. All right, so there we go. Bearings pressed in, the clearances are nice. Let's see how this mounts up. So we'll take our retaining collar. I want to get that nice and tight and really capture that bearing. I'll grab our primary. We'll get our secondary. Put that on there. It looks like it's misaligned a little bit, but look how much thread we have. We have all that thread to work with. So we can just use the washers that came with the kit. Put that back on there. It looks like 2 washers is going to be it. We have all this thread to lock everything up. We have good clearances. And since the primary and secondary are running closer to this plate, it's going to be a million times stronger. Now, here's what I want to show you though. This gearbox is kind of weird. So normally first gear is 1-to-1. For every 1 rotation of this, you get 1 rotation on your output because they're connected. So let's check this out. Mark that. And we will try to mark this spline right here. So count it. There's 1 revolution. There's 2 revolutions. But we only had 1 on the output. This gearbox is a 1-to-2 ratio, which means you can run a smaller rear sprocket, which means you don't need to run a big 62 sprocket. I'm going to run, I think, an 11 40, so it'll be 3.3 overall gear ratio. Now take your tire size into account for that. And let's check reverse. Now, this is cool. Oh, we should line it back up. Hang on. Let's line back up our lines so we can count it. So there's reverse. There's 1. There's 2. And there's 3. So reverse is 1 to 3. So I don't know what the deal is with that. It's probably a speed limiter built into it. But what that means is there's a lot of torque going through here. So when I use reverse in this, there's no way I'm pushing the gas pedal all the way. Like, it's going to be super, super easy. Alright, so here we stand. I put the 520 sprocket on there. You saw that in the time lapse. Easy peasy. That rear end is just disgustingly cool. So here's what we got to do now. The original sprocket position was between here, and now it is over here, which is about 3 inches over, maybe 2.5. But our motor plate is lined up for the original position. So this is going to be a lot of work just to move this motor plate over 2.5 inches. But it's got to be done, so let's tackle it. Alright, so I've got the motor sitting on the motor mount that I cut out of the cart. Everything's all prepped and ready to go back in, but we got to figure out a way to mount this gearbox. We can't just have it all the pressure on that shaft. So there are mounting holes on the bottom here, and they line up kind of with this here, right? So I'm thinking about extending the lower ones, cutting these apart, extending the lower ones, making some tabs of plate to go across the top, and this will be all one unit. How cool is that? All right, so I've got my 3 pieces of 1.5 inches. In the grand scheme of things, 1.5 inches added to the engine height isn't going to do anything, and it's going to make clearance for a reverse gearbox. So I extended this out so it fits nicely in the engine compartment. I made this plate. I'm going to weld that on, make a couple tabs, put these bolts in. Now what this is doing is just making one engine and gearbox mount, so that you're not fidgeting with separating the gearbox from the engine. Mounting it together is going to make it a ton stronger, and I can fine-tune the adjustments to the motor mount before I mount it in the cart. And when it's all finished, it's going to be super strong, super stable, super square, super aligned. Everything that we want happening with this engine. All right, this is it right before welding. I've got my tabs on, I've got my bolts in, the bolts are tight. And now I'm just going to take a minute to do final alignment. There's space for these bolts, so you want to make sure it's nice and straight. And then we'll bolt it in, bolt it to this motor mount, and just take the motor mount and everything, throw it in the cart for chain alignment. That way we know we'll be able to get the same exact alignment. Engine is mounted, mostly welded. I might add another cross member. It's definitely in my mind. I have 4 good points plus this whole back side. Everything is aligned well. The only thing I don't like about this gearbox is that it's a 530 chain. This isn't 300 horsepower. This gearbox is made for 20 horsepower engines, so to make it a 530 chain annoys me. Relocated the fuel tank. That was always part of the plan, because when the fuel tank's in its stock location, it hits the seat. So I was always going to relocate it. So as you saw in the time lapse, I just made a cross member, just measured it out, and then welded these plates, leveled the brackets, and just welded it right to that. If I need to, I can add more bracing, but if you slow down the time lapse, you can see that I stood on these brackets and it didn't go anywhere. So, like where the gas tank is now, the filler is easier to get to. There's enough distance away from the head that it's not going to get any heat from that, and I can just run the fuel line right to the carb. Coming right along, next step is just running the cables and getting the shifter on. Alright, so the shifter is actually kind of easy. It comes with this bracket. You just route it, run your lines, and here's what I did for the front. I just made this simple bracket. There's a bolt that runs through for the whole shifter, but I took one of the bolts and I just welded it on the inside so it's easily removable and easy to align. I got a nut on there. And then it's going to be as simple as assembling it. Now I've kind of pre-disclosed where I want the shifter. Low, because I don't see a lot of shifting going on. And then I'm just going to run that bolt, do final alignments, and tack it up. Easy peasy. Now, I put it here because this is my daughter's seating position. So always work towards your greatest limiting factor. Oh yeah, that's crazy. Now, the reason I put it up here and out of the way is because I want to put an e-brake here, and I think the e-brake will be used more than the gear selector. Gear selector is done. Oh, I love it. That's so smooth. It's way better than I thought it would be, like most things. Now, I did clearance this, so I had room for my bodywork if I put it on. And it's just these two bolts to put it on and take it off. Fantastic. All right. All right, so closing thoughts on the Blast LED reverse gearbox for big block engines. It robs a lot of power. Reverse is cool, and for some it's an absolute necessity, but from what I found, the 530 chain, that big heavy weighted chain, plus the gearbox itself, seems to rob a lot of power from that engine. Now I'm going to work on it. I gotta have a Mikuni carburetor. I'm waiting to pull the governor off and use the Mikuni carburetor, which from what I've seen, it changes how it drives. Like, it gives it a little more power, but just changes the throttle curve, the torque curve, the power curve, whatever you want to call it. So I'm hoping that restores some of that lost power from the drivetrain. Installation, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't super difficult. Just alignment stuff, the final cable install, like, it was pretty straightforward, especially how I did it. I didn't use the brackets where I use the gearbox as a chain tensioner because I'm using the KGA Racing Homebrew, which makes it easy for chain adjustment. The 530 chain was obviously different than a 420 chain that I was using, so the links didn't line up, and it was literally 5 minutes to put the chain on. It was actually pretty nice. This kart as a whole is phenomenal. It is absolutely phenomenal. The suspension, the 3-inch stretch. Before that gearbox was on, I thought the power was just fine. Like, you could do donuts, you could do burnouts. It felt fast once the CVT caught up and the motor really started pumping out. Yeah, this is completely a viable option. I know I kind of went backwards. I built a 50 horsepower one, then I built a 100 horsepower one, then I regressed back to 20 horsepower. But that's kind of my thing. I like doing big things with not enough. You can tell by my little home garage here, and not a lot of fancy tools. That I just like to, that's what I dig, is just that kind of ingenuity. So we're definitely going to run this more. We're definitely going to do more upgrades. That was the whole idea of the budget kart itself, is start simple, start cheap, and then just keep upgrading until you have this extraordinary machine that you'd be proud of. I've been proud of this from day one. It was easy to build, it was quick to build, and then just the upgrades that we've done is just absolutely incredible. So thank you guys for tuning in. The longtime supporters, you guys are awesome. It means the world to me when you guys say a nice comment to me or just message me and just tell me that you like what I'm doing. It means a lot, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'll see you guys on the next one.